I'm probably more of a wannabe minimalist than a proper minimalist, but regardless, I love a minimalist design aesthetic and very bare bones minimalist music production setups. I cycle through a lot of gear, but I like to keep each setup very small and very self-contained. So today I want to discuss a bunch of very minimalist music production setups. And real quick, let's get the obvious out of the way, which is a computer or a tablet. Obviously, that is kind of the very minimum music production setup that you can take with you anywhere if you're just making music off of a laptop or off of an iPad. That, of course, is going to give you the absolute most power and flexibility. And with an iPad, there is a shocking amount of apps that give you quite a hands-on music making experience with a lot of room for experimentation. But I wanted to get into the hardware world here, something that's physical and a lot more tactile, and get a hands-on workflow built into a minimalist music production setup. So the first thing I want to mention is the Roland Lightpad block. This, in its most basic form, is just a MIDI controller. It's got a few interesting things going for it, however. First of all, the obvious, it's very small. So far, it is the smallest commercially available MIDI controller I've been able to find, with one exception that I'll get into in a second. But also, it's got these LED pads that form kind of the grid structure that a lot of us beat makers are used to, and these can change depending on the context that they find themselves in. So this connects to a piece of software on your computer, or it can also connect to a phone or a tablet via Bluetooth, which is quite nice. And the light up pads can change their configuration to reflect scales, to show drum pads, to even show some like mixer settings and a bunch of other stuff that Roland has programmed this thing to be able to do. It's got its own plugins and software that it's meant to talk to, but you can use this to control absolutely anything. And if that plugin is MPE capable, even better, because this thing is meant to be expressive. It's velocity sensitive, and you can like slide your finger around to get a sound that changes over time, like in real time with the movement you make over the pads. And while that can seem like a little bit of a gimmick, it can be really nice because like there's no pitch mod wheel and there are no like physical knobs, but this means that you still get some hands-on control over those kinds of elements in something that is tiny. Oh, and it's USB-C, which is great. This lived in my backpack for a long time, just with my laptop. So whenever I wanted to work on music, I could just get this, have my laptop out, and that is all I needed for a hands-on but pretty inconspicuous music making process, which was really cool. And that's ultimately why I recommend this thing. The expressive playing and like the 5D sound is nice, but it's really the size and the flexibility that makes this thing really stand out for very minimalist music production setups. I said I was going to get to the other smallest MIDI controller that I could find. This is the Artifan Orba, and actually, funnily enough, this is another MPE-enabled MIDI controller. So this is expressive, but in different ways than this. It's also velocity sensitive, and it also has features like the ability to change a sound based on how it's rotated, which is super interesting. Once again, this is also very small. It's got a similar footprint, like it's a little thicker, but it's smaller in terms of its area. This is a little bit weirder than this one. Like I would tend to recommend the Roland Lightpad block over the Artifan Orba. I think this is more flexible and it adheres a little more to kind of a normal design philosophy, whereas this has got like the circular kind of radial pattern, and it's not quite that ergonomic to play with your thumb. So you're going to lay it on the table and then you lose a degree of expression. And at the time I'm filming this product doesn't feel like it's quite finished. Like there's some kind of gaps in the software that comes with it. But the other thing that it does have going for it is that it can hold MIDI data just by itself, and then that can be fed into a DAW later. So if you want to just have this as a little looping musical sketchpad, you can absolutely do that. Once again, super cool, super compact. One more super tiny device that's worth mentioning is the PO33KO. This is a pocket operator by Teenage Engineering. This is the sampler, and in my opinion, the most useful one and the most versatile. You can sample stuff directly into it. That's the only way to get sounds into it, via its line in, so you can sample stuff off of your phone, from your laptop, from external gear. that can all just live in here. You know, it's got a pretty small sample memory, but it's enough to make a song. And then just like with a bigger groove box, you sequence patterns and you can actually build up a song, and it's even got effects and some live performance tools. So you're definitely going to have to embrace the limited voice count and a somewhat lo-fi aesthetic with this thing. And making a full song in it can be a little bit of a pain, although it 100% can be done if you've got the patience. So this thing is a little bit slept on, but very powerful. And of course it can be synced with other gear. That's a little less minimalist in terms of like you have cables running everywhere, but it's still quite minimalist in terms of size because I mean, look at it. It's adorable. So the PO33KO, the tiniest sampler with a surprising amount of power, definitely worth a mention. Staying in kind of the self-contained music production device category, a lot of you who have watched this channel for a while probably saw this coming a mile away. I want to recommend the Roland MC101. This thing goes for $400 to $500 and is an entirely self-contained music production station. It's got 4 tracks, and they can be either drum machines or synthesizers / samplers. You can load samples in via the SD card. It's got an incredibly powerful synth engine that a lot of Roland gear is now kind of based on. And you can record the individual tracks of this over USB into your DAW so you can like fine-tune them and process them later. I've talked about this thing at length. Those of you who have watched this channel for a while are probably rolling your eyes a bit at hearing these same talking points, but it is really worth repeating because once again, you can just use this by itself and then still use a DAW to get the most polish out of it. And it's tiny, and you will have to put up with a little bit of menu diving, but it's gotten much better with some firmware updates, and now I can use this thing very quickly and intuitively. I said this before in a previous video, and I stand by it 100%. If I could have only one piece of music production hardware, at least to start off, it would be this. Because when using it self-contained, it's about as minimalist as you can possibly get while really not sacrificing much power. You can get a lot out of these 4 tracks, and you've got the flexibility to have a hybrid workflow between this and a DAW. This is a really fantastic device. It's really grown up over the course of getting updated, and it's great to see Roland kind of committed to really getting into the groovebox game and making something cool. One other self-contained device that of course I have to mention is the Novation Circuit. This has been a huge part of this channel, and I can't not mention it here. This is the Novation Circuit Tracks, which is the new edition, and here's something that's interesting about that in terms of a minimalist setup. So the big upgrade that the tracks got, among other things, is the ability to not only have extra MIDI tracks to sequence external synths, but to then bring that audio back in to get processed and mixed by the circuit. So it basically turns any external synthesizer into an extension of itself. So the effect that this has is really simplifying a DAW-less setup. Like, you don't have to have a mixer because this is the mixer. You have the brain of the setup right here. It's got its own synth and drum tracks built in. And so then you just bring in a couple external synths or drum machines that you really like, sync them up and control them with this, bring the audio in, and you've got an entire setup. It's still kind of a lot of cables and is definitely not nearly as minimalist as some of the other stuff I've talked about in this video, but it is the most minimalist big table full of gear setup I have found. Like, I always went for completely self-contained stuff until very recently when I got the tracks, because the tracks made it so much cleaner and easier to deal with a bunch of gear all synced together. Like, it single-handedly got me into that world because it goes out of its way to give a really clean user experience for dealing with a bunch of gear. So that is kind of an honorable mention for minimalist gear. And of course, you can just use it by itself, and I've made albums worth of music with just the circuit by itself as well. If I could only get one piece of gear, I'd still get the Roland MC101. If I could only have 2 pieces of gear, I would probably own the Novation Circuit Tracks and the Arturia Microfreak, which is an incredibly versatile budget hardware synthesizer. So as you may have noticed, this video wandered pretty far into the kind of hardware self-contained category because that really appeals to my love of self-contained music production setups. It does have a very minimalist approach and can be a really clean and a compact way of making music. And that's what I tend to focus on because that's kind of my area of expertise here on YouTube. But I do want to also mention there are other fantastic controllers for your DAW out there. The Machine Micro Mark III is something that I've had my eye on for a little while that gives you a pretty incredible value for the money that you pay for it and is quite small as well. And then of course there's stuff like the Akai MPK Mini, which has mini keys. A lot of us will get along with those just fine, and pads and some knobs. There's a Tetra video that sort of inspired this video that I'll link to up over here. And if you'd like to see reviews of the Roland MC101 and the Roly Lightpad block, my top recommendations from this video for properly minimalist setups, you can click or tap down over here somewhere. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.